Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Nicole, and today I'm going to be talking to you about some of the oldest books on my TBR. So I had a lot of time to read in February. Well, I don't know if that's true. I don't know that I actually had more time than usual, but that's not the point. The point is that at some point I ran out of books that I was planning on reading, and so I had to come up with something else to read. And so I decided to challenge myself for 1 week to just start working through some of the oldest books on my TBR or my to be read list. And the way I decided how to do this is I took some time one day and I sat down and I sorted my to be read pile on the story graph, and I set it to filter and show me the books that I added to Storygraph the earliest. And then I took a selection of like maybe 10 books, looked at them, and then chose three to read. And today I'm going to share with you my thoughts on the three books that I read, how that went, and if I regret buying these books. Does that happen to you? Do you buy books and then read them and go, man, I should have checked that out of the library? Anyway, let's go ahead and get into it. The first book that I'm going to talk about is Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. Yes, somehow this is one of the books that I added first to my TBR pile on the story graph. I also bought it quite a while ago, and then it just sat there on my bookshelf. In fact, it continued to sit there even after I read The Martian last year and absolutely loved it. So I was glad to see this pop up as one of my, I think, top 30 oldest books. Like, I think that's what I looked at. And yeah, I read it this week. So let me tell you about it and what I think now that I've read it. So, Project Hail Mary is a sci fi novel where a gentleman wakes up somewhere. We start going along with our character as he starts to try and make his way and figure out what on earth is going on, where he is, and why he's there before time runs out. Because is time running out? I don't know. It all seems urgent and the stakes seem high. And it turns out they are. This was a wonderful book. I really enjoyed it. It covers a lot of themes that felt familiar to me from The Martian, as well as some newer themes and ideas. Some of the things that you can expect to come up in this book are ideas of self sacrifice, space travel, exploration, and research, as well as a few other things. But I feel like if I talked about those, that it would be a spoiler. This book definitely has the potential to be spoiled much more so than The Martian. So if you're thinking about reading this book, I recommend really not looking much into it. For me, the two highest points in this book had to be the character and the narration. Those were both things that I enjoyed in The Martian, and this book just felt like more of the same. In fact, so much more of the same that I almost felt like it was the same narrator and character from The Martian. This entire book is told in first person, so you get to know our protagonist really well. And if you liked The Martian, if you've read The Martian and you liked that protagonist, the sort of sense of humor and seriousness and the mix of science and like just fun, then you will probably also like the protagonist in Project Hail Mary. I think one of the potential lows of this book is that it was more of the same. So if you read The Martian and you didn't like that book, I'm not sure you'd like this one any better. It really is and does feel like the same person. So I was kind of surprised by how similar the voices were. I kind of felt like, can't we have a slightly different feeling character, but just a similar writing style? And the answer appears to be no. The only other qualm with this book really had to do with the plot and not the action and adventure that happened in the plot itself, but more the pacing of it. There are a couple of sort of subplots going on, and one of them took up a huge chunk of the book. And I think in some ways, understandably, because it created a major complication that our protagonist had to figure out. But I felt like it just went on for too long, and that this book actually could have been maybe 50 to 60 pages shorter if that had have been handled in some different manner. And I don't even necessarily think it had to be that particular subplot. There was at least one other time where a complication came up and I just felt like we spent way too long on it, and it did serve the plot later on, but I felt like you could have had a similar event happen and be shorter and have moved through it more quickly. And I'm sorry I'm being so vague, but I really just don't want to get into the plot details. Just know that I do think this book has a few pacing problems. I did still give this book 4 stars. I really enjoyed it, and I would recommend it to anyone anyone who is a fan of The Martian, for one. I know I keep mentioning that, but it's true. I would also recommend this to anyone who likes science fiction, but maybe wants a more lighthearted science fiction read that still has high stakes, but isn't also gloom depressing and like completely make you feel horrible and down about life. I think the tone in this tends to stay pretty well on the light side of things, even when hard things are being dealt with. They're not dwelled on for such a long time that you yourself, as the reader, start to feel depressed. I also think this book is great for people who like plot driven novels. And the only other thing that I would say is be sure to like the amnesia trope. I know that is something that not everybody likes in their books. And if you are one of those people, it's in there. It's not the entire book, and I thought it was really interesting how, he sort of gets his memory back, but it is in there pretty prevalently, especially at the beginning of the book. So if that's something you don't like, you may want to be wary in reading this book. The next book that I picked up is the 2021 winner of the Booker Prize, and that is The Promise by Damon Galgut. And this book tells the story of what happens in the Swart family after the mother Rachel has passed away. Rachel's dying wish to her husband is that he will leave their servant and one-time family slave the home that the servant leaves in. That is the one thing that Rachel asks her husband to do, as she feels like it's basically the only thing that is fair. The only problem with her request is that the only other person who hears it is her young daughter, Amor, and Amor seems to be the only member of the family who actually cares whether or not that promise is fulfilled. Because this book is situated in South Africa at the beginning of the Soweto uprising, you get a lot of the background and history of South Africa subtly interwoven into the story, and particularly into the lives of the Swart family. And so, as a result of that, this book ends up following both the Swart family as well as the Soweto uprising and the end of apartheid and everything that's going on in South Africa over the course of a couple of decades. And naturally, this book ends up discussing issues of race, family, religion, inheritance, coming of age, and promise keeping. I think for me, the biggest high in this book definitely just surrounded the idea of coming to age and growing up and changing times, both with and with outside the family, and just the intersection of how what was going on in South Africa and the country affected the daily lives of the people within it. And I thought combining those two things was really ingenious because I think sometimes history can feel impersonal when you read about it, but having it within the context of a fiction novel allows you to see on a more intimate level how people's lives are affected by historical events around them. Sadly, however, especially given that this is a book I've been waiting years to read because I got it not long after it won the Booker Prize, I really didn't end up liking this book as much as I had hoped to. And for me, the biggest problem I had with this book had to do with the narration. So the vast majority of the book, I would say, is told in the third person, though sometimes the second person and occasionally the first person. And that just goes exactly to what my problem was with the narration of the story. You do follow multiple characters in this book. There is a sense of stream of consciousness that does happen and go on. So you do merge from one point of view to another, but there is also a narrative voice in the background. And it was the narrative voice that kept grating on my nerves because in one paragraph, that narrative voice could go from third person to second person to in the first person perspective of somebody else. And it just was confusing and garbled and at times even felt very unintentional. And I just felt like it was a distraction from the story that was being told. I think if it had have just stuck to the stream of consciousness and let the narrative voice fall further into the background, it would have been more effective. But as it was one of the least effective parts of this story for me, which made it very frustrating. There was one point where I almost really wanted to DNF the book, and I didn't because it's not that long a book, and I really wanted to know what the story was and how it worked out. The action that was happening and the plotting of the story itself was pretty interesting, so I hung in there for it, and I guess it was worth it. I also had issues with the characters in this book, particularly the male characters in this book. I don't know if it was the author's intent to give the reader the impression that every male in South Africa during this time period was either a chauvinist or a misogynist, but all of them in this book were. Every single last one. None of them could pass a woman without making some comment about how she looked or having some sort of like super sexualized thought about her or thinking about her in just some denigrating way. It didn't matter whether the woman was young, old, related to them, dead. It just got weird. And it was like every guy, no matter their position. And the thing that really bothered me about it, beyond everything that I just said about that, is that it made all the male characters feel exactly the same. Like there really could have just been one super misogynistic, chauvinistic guy in the entire book, and it would have completed like that whole side and perspective, because you knew anytime you went into the male perspective and got his stream of consciousness, you knew what you were getting. He was going to have some skeevy thought about whatever woman happened to walk by in that moment, and I just did not appreciate that, did not need it, and didn't like it. I ended up giving this book 3 stars somehow. I guess because I was that invested in the theme and did like the plot. I guess I would still recommend this book to people, but I would definitely say you need to like literary fiction. I feel like this is sort of like the height of literary fiction and what people like in that, in terms of it being almost as much about or more about the writing than it is about the story and the plot. And I feel like this book fell on that side of it. And even then, I don't think it did it well. But if you want to give it a try and you're interested in the Soweto uprising and the end of apartheid and just how that affected different people's lives, particularly from a white family's perspective, and just the conflict that that would bring into their families itself, then I guess you could read this book, but I'm sure there are probably also better books to read on the same topic. At this point during the week, I was starting to wonder how things were going to go. I did try one other book that I'm not going to talk about because I ended up DNFing it, and that was The Wind Up Bird Chronicle by Haruki Murakami. And yeah, I got 11 pages in and I said, nope, no, thank you. And that was a second chance book for me with that author. And yeah, I don't know how much more I'm going to try by him in hopes that it will be better. So I just ended up moving on to my third and final book for the week, and that was Egalia's Daughter by Gerd Brantenberg. And this is called A Satire of the Sexes, and it definitely is. This book tells the story of a young boy, Patronus, who all he wants to be when he grows up is a diver. He lives in a portside town, and fishing and diving are one of the most, if not the most, important industries in his port town. The only problem with his plan is that he's a boy. Because in Eagleston, which is in the land of Egalia, women hold all the power and are the directors of their home and the region, and the men and boys just tend to stay home. They hope to be housebounds when they are older and just take care of the family and the kids and the house. So, this is definitely a book where gender roles are reversed, and it is speculative fiction, and it explores the idea of where does gender subjugation come from? Does it come from power? And if so, does it matter who wields that power? Everything in this book is flipped upside down. The men are no longer just called men, they're called minwim. The women are not called women, they're called womb, because the whole idea is that if you're now in a super matriarchal society, then everything is focused on the womb. This book explores a lot of different ideas surrounding gender, as well as occasionally dipping into class issues, but you get into politics, power, gender roles, of course, but there's even discussion of freedom and happiness. For me, the highs of this book definitely had to do with the world building as well as the themes. In the writing of this book, so much attention is paid to just all those bits of language that sort of lean towards a patriarchal background, like the word women itself, and explores the idea of how much we make gender roles become part of even just our everyday speech. I really appreciated the way that was explored. This book is just fascinating in the way that these themes are brought in. The first few pages of this book had me laughing so hard that I was crying, but very shortly after that, I just started to realize how tragic some of the things going on in this book were. I feel like, as much as being a satire, this book is also like tragicomic, where it talks about, even at the end of the book, how different people, could react, and how you might find this entire book hilarious. You might find this entire book unsettling. You may find yourself crying. I mean, it's all there, because some of it is just spelled out and it's just so ridiculous that you can't help laugh at it and laugh at yourself. But then at the same time, you're like, it's so sad that life is actually like this. And I just thought it was brilliant that one author could bring all that together in this speculative work. The book is also divided into two sections, and this gets to me to what I felt like was kind of a low in the book. Not the fact that it was split into two sections, but I actually felt like the second half of the book just didn't hold up as well as the first part of the book. Because this book does follow Patronus and he starts out as a young boy, it is also a bit of a coming of age for him as he grows over the course of the book and gets older and just sort of has to make and find his own way. And in book two, you start to get a lot more into his adult life and him sort of, taking control of his own agency and his own person. That said, you kind of go into the idea of gender roles also sort of moving and changing and being explored and challenged as well, which I loved and thought was great. But I did feel like the second half of the book, you started to get in a lot more into the politics and the ideology of gender roles, and that started to take over Patronus's plot and story. So the second half of the book just ended up feeling like all the plotting was just for the sake of getting people to sit down in different locations and talk about their ideas. It was a lot of monologues going on, a lot of speeches being given and read, and I just didn't enjoy it as much as the first half. I I really wanted to continue more thoroughly with Patronus, and he does still feature prominently in the second half of the book, but it's like you get a whole bunch of monologues and speeches followed by a short chapter that's like Patronus in like day-to-day life. And I wanted those two things to just be integrated together more smoothly than they were in the second part of the book. So that definitely dropped the rating on it for a bit. For it didn't drop it that much. I still gave this book 4.5 stars. Another excellent recommendation by my friend Zoe, who is the one who recommended this book to me. I still have to call her and tell her I've read it. We are going to have the best conversation about this ever. I just know it. She's a blast. I recommend this book to anyone who likes speculative fiction or might want to try it, who is interested in ideologies and just discussions surrounding gender roles, who likes books that talk about fighting for what is right and for justice, and anyone who enjoys a good coming of age story, which I definitely do, and this definitely fits that vibe. That's it. Those are the 3 books that I read that have that are up there with some of the books that I have not only owned for quite a while, but have been wanting to read for a very long time. And how did I do? Well, 2 out of 3 of them were over 4 stars for me, and there was just the one that was a 3 star and the one that I DNF'd and I'm just going to unhaul. So 50-50 that they're going to work out well for me. So that kind of makes me excited to keep reading more. Though I have to say, the ones that were rough were really, really rough. And one of the ones that I didn't like, The Promise, actually surprised me that I didn't like it. So I guess my takeaway from doing this little experiment is that I definitely need to keep working through the oldest books that are on my TBR, that I shouldn't give up on them, and that I may be disappointed by ones that I'm not expecting. I can say I was expecting to like both of these, so I'm not surprised that I did. So I guess it's just going to get down to, am I going to find surprises in there? Like ones that I'm starting to think I wouldn't like anymore because I bought them so long ago and my tastes have changed. I don't know. So we'll see if I get any surprises, but I'm definitely going to do this experiment again sometime. I don't know when. We'll see when it comes up, or if something like that comes up in my TBR game. Let me know if you have books that have been sitting on your shelves for a while and if you plan on reading them anytime soon. And I'll talk to you next time. Bye.